The biggest challenge of my career to date was learning and memorizing all 48 preludes and fugues of the well-tempered clavier. Although I had studied many of them in my early years, it was still a huge amount of work to not only learn the rest of them, but rethink those I had already done. No music, however, gives you greater satisfaction, and to perform them as I'm doing in 2007 and 2008 will, I hope, bring their beauty to a great number of music lovers around the world. This was the music that composers afterwards were brought up on. Mozart arranged many of them for string trio and quartet. His wife Constanza even fell in love with them, thought them most artistic, and craved them the way a pregnant woman craves food. Beethoven played most of them by the age of 11. Fanny Mendelssohn gave a complete performance from memory when she was just 13. Robert and Clara Schumann studied a prelude and fugue each day during the first weeks of their marriage. Robert Schumann advised every musician to let the well-tempered clavier be your daily bread. Then you will certainly become a solid musician. It is important not to approach these preludes and fugues too soon. By that, I mean that the student should already have a solid grounding in Bach, having learned the little preludes, the 2- and 3-part inventions, and some of the French suites. There is no way you can tackle a 4-voice fugue properly unless you can already play cleanly and intelligently in 2 and 3 voices. I also think it necessary to follow that progression even if the student is already quite technically advanced at the keyboard but has never previously studied Baroque music. The teacher also must make sure that the student understands the structure of fugues and is familiar with all the terminology: subject, counter-subject, inversion, augmentation, diminution, episode, stretto, etc. Then the real work begins. I will talk about editions later, but it is best to choose one that is urtext and has the original markings, meaning hardly any. That way you are not influenced by any editorial suggestions. You will have to read through the fugue to get an idea of the tempo you want to eventually play it at. I have already talked a lot about choosing a tempo, so I won't repeat that here, but I will emphasize its relationship to fingering and articulation. That is why you have to at least have an idea of a tempo to begin with. Then choose an articulation for the subject, following what I have already said about musical line and thinking of it in terms of bowed instruments and the voice. Once you have decided on it, write it in for each time the subject appears and in every voice. I say that because often a student will completely forget about it once the subject enters in the bass or in a middle voice divided between the hands. Then you must do the same for the counter-subject or counter-subjects, as there might be several. It's a good idea to choose an articulation that will contrast with that of the subject. Bach wasn't stupid. His counter-subjects are usually quite contrasting anyway, so this isn't difficult. To illustrate this, let's go back to that C minor fugue in Book 1. If you play the counter-subject legato, smoothly, then it throws the subject nicely into relief. The subject will be reminded is this. The counter-subject is. Now, if you play that all detached, along with the subject, you would get this. Which I don't think brings the subject out enough into relief. So if you slur the counter-subject, you get this. Which I think is much easier to listen to. Those slurred notes should also be marked in the score every time they appear, especially where you have to play both subject and counter-subject with the same hand. We have in bar 20 of this fugue, for instance, that's very difficult to do because you have to play staccato and legato with the same hand. If you don't slur the counter-subject, then it becomes much easier to play, but far less effective. Always think horizontally, never vertically. Or at least you can think vertically when feeling the harmonic progressions, but they come about because of the simultaneous horizontal voices. I'd like to show you this with the B-flat minor prelude from Book 1 of the Well-Tempered Clavier. It's a prelude, not a fugue, but the counterpoint is lovely, although people still tend to think of this vertically. At the beginning there, we really have four different ideas. We have the bass line, which is a continuous B flat. We have the inner voice in the left hand, which gives the harmony. And then we have the two upper voices. So together that makes. Then you have to start deciding on all the fingering, and that demands patience. Do this hands separately, although occasionally you will have to take notes from the other staff, but that will become obvious as you progress. And also do this without pedal. If you don't do this hands separately, you will waste a lot of time. One of the most common faults occurs when notes are tied over and held for several beats, with another voice being played by the same hand. The inexperienced Bach player will often forget and let go of these notes too soon, thus ruining the harmony. The neatness, accuracy, and discipline you develop learning Bach in this way will serve you well when learning any composer. While you are deciding on the fingering, you could also be absorbing the structure of the fugue. And don't forget, write in the fingering so that when you go back to it the next day, the work is already done. Then comes the point where you have to begin deciding about the interpretation and the best way to make the structure of the fugue audible to the listener. It isn't enough just to bang out the subject every time it appears. In fact, that can be one of the worst ways to interpret a fugue. The balance with all the other voices is extremely important and can be constantly varied. Of course, the subject should always be heard to some degree, but if there is one thing I learned while recording all the 48, it is that often you will hear the subject better if you take the overall dynamic down a notch. This results in a far greater clarity and allows you to save something for the climax of the piece. I also learned that in a stretto passage, that's one where there are entrances of the subject overlapping each other, it is best to bring out the voice that the ear will not naturally follow. Let me show you that in the wonderful B-flat minor fugue from Book 2 of the Well-Tempered Clavier. There's a passage here where we have the subject in both the top voice and the bottom voice. In the top we have which we've already become familiar with since we've heard it from the beginning of the fugue. And then we have it one beat delayed in the bass. So since this passage starts with the subject on the top voice, the ear will naturally hear that. What it might not hear unless we bring it out is that subject in the bass line. At some point, you might want to bring out the counter subject more. Often the episodes give you the chance to lighten up a bit in both touch and feeling. When studying a fugue that is particularly dense, it's a useful exercise, and I stress exercise because you would never play it this way in performance, to play it bringing out each voice in turn. This will help clarify the part writing in your mind and your fingers. As an example of this, let me show you the F minor fugue from Book 1. I'll play this part 4 times, bringing out each voice in turn, starting with the top voice, which has the subject. Now I'll bring out the alto voice. And now the tenor voice, which is perhaps the most difficult one to bring out. And finally, the bass line. Now, I don't suggest playing it in performance like any of those ways. In the end, you have to balance everything out to make music. So you could play it like this. But at least the clarity of the voice leading is in your mind. You can also be even more adventurous and play one voice while singing another simultaneously. I used to do this with the D major fugue from Book 2. At the beginning, one thing that separates the good Bach pianist from the not-so-good Bach pianist is this degree of separation that he or she is able to acquire between the different voices. I cannot stress the importance of this voicing enough. Once that basic work is done, you have to figure out an overall scheme of dynamics. I like to call this a roadmap of where you are going. Some fugues begin quietly and build up to a climax at the end. Others might have the climax in the middle, or at least several lines before the end. This is especially important in the long fugues that need constant direction if we are not to feel lost and our audience bored. If you are lost, the listener will be totally lost. After all that work is done, you have to make music out of it all. But the music will never come unless the basics are there to begin with.